Lou Douglas lecture of this year. The Lou Douglas Lecture Series was created to honor the memory of Lou Douglas, who was a professor in the political science department. He dedicated his life to pursuing justice and equality for all, and a lecture series has for 20 years now been bringing speakers to speak on these issues. And this evening we've got another great hoping, and I'm sure. A couple of things. We're going to have a brief question and answer period after the lecture's over. If you guys can stick around for that, we would appreciate it. It's a good time to kind of hear some ideas of the speakers on some things that you guys are concerned about. And also, as you're leaving tonight after question and answer, if you don't need your program, if you've got one from a different lecture, if you could hand it back to the interns, they'll be collecting them outside. We're trying to recycle to kind of cut down on reprinting costs. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Lloyd Thomas now. Dr. Thomas is a professor in the Department of Economics at Kansas State University, and he's going to get things started. Thanks.
Thank you, Kimberly. Lou Douglas will be proud of our topic tonight, inequality of income in America. And he would be delighted with our speaker, Professor James Galbraith of the University of Texas. Lou Douglas stood for social justice. Perhaps the most troubling characteristic of our relatively unfettered capitalistic system that we have is the extreme inequality in the income distribution and distribution of wealth that this system has produced. You may have heard some of the statistics. I'll just review a couple of these. If we look just at wage and salary income alone, the top 5% of households in America receive 30% of the nation's earnings. More importantly, the bottom 40% earn only about 5% of the nation's aggregate income. And most of you are aware that CEOs of Fortune 500 corporations make 475 times as much income as the typical worker at the same company. 30 years ago, they were making perhaps 20 times as much. So we've had this dramatic increase in inequality. And most of you, probably all of you, are aware that there's Bill Gates is probably the most wealthy individual in America. His wealth fluctuates between $50 billion and $100 billion, depending on the stock market that particular day. In fact, the most recent issue of Forbes magazine showed that there were a handful of CEOs whose net worth alone of one individual exceed the aggregate net worth of the poorest 40 million American households. 40 million households might be 100 million people. Now, I know some students have a little trouble with numbers of that magnitude. Presidential candidates have trouble with numbers of that magnitude. So let me just give an example. Most of you are football fans. K-State Stadium holds 50,000 people. 100 million people would be 2,000 football stadiums like K-State aggregated. A football field is 100 yards long, so it would take about 17 football fields to make a mile. Picture a steady stream of football fields continuously from Manhattan to Kansas City. 2,000 football fields, each one holding 50,000 fans. Well, we have half a dozen individuals in this country apparently who have more net wealth than all of those fans combined. Now that is inequality. A couple of other statistics. The top 20%, if you ignore the house that people own, the highest 20% of Americans hold 93% of the wealth, and the bottom 30% have zero or negative wealth. Their debts, their credit card debts, car loans, etc., exceed their assets. In 1962, while I was a college student, I worked at Pepsi-Cola, throwing cases of empty Pepsis onto a belt to be thrown through a cleaner, through a washer. And I received the minimum wage. It was $1.25 an hour. Well, today, the minimum wage is $5.15 an hour, which is more than a 300% increase. But the price level today is more than 400% higher than it was in 1962, which would mean the minimum wage would need to be at least around $7.15 to maintain the real wage where it was in 1962. But if any given group in the labor market is to maintain the same share of the aggregate income in the nation, they need to receive wage increases equivalent to the inflation rate plus the growth of productivity. Well, since 1962, productivity growth has averaged 2% a year, and at that rate, living standards would double about every 35 years. And applying that to the minimum wage back in 1962, today's minimum wage would need to be over $14 an hour if a given person receiving that wage were to receive the same share of the nation's income that a person did in 1962. So we can see that the bottom tier of Americans that are earning close to the minimum wage have fallen dramatically behind. In earlier times, before the great increase in inequality that commenced about 30 years ago, we were a nation of predominantly middle-class Americans. There was a sense of solidarity, that we are in this thing together, that we're all part of the man. And I think this sense of solidarity helped America get through such great national crises as the Great Depression and World War II. Galbraith's highly acclaimed book is entitled Created Unequal, The Crisis in American Pay. In this book, Professor Galbraith argues cogently that by loosening these ties of solidarity, this increasing inequality constitutes an important threat to the fabric of our democracy. Think about it a little bit. We know that inequality of income and wealth leads to inequality of political influence. And think of 100 million. Think of a society in which maybe 100 million Americans have nothing at stake in the economy and have no influence politically. This is not the kind of America that we had in the past, and I don't think it's the kind of America most people want to have in the future. But Galbraith is an optimist. He believes that this great inequality is not a necessary or inevitable result of capitalism. Rather, he demonstrates that public policy has contributed to the rising inequality, and public policy could potentially do much to arrest the increase in inequality and reduce it. So we are fortunate tonight to have as our speaker one of America's most noted students of the economics of inequality, James Galbraith. Professor Galbraith received his undergraduate education at Harvard. He studied at King's College in Cambridge as a Marshall Scholar, and he took his PhD at Yale University. Early on, he worked in policy circles in Washington. He served as an economist on the Committee on Banking, Finance, and Urban Affairs in the late 70s when he helped draft the Humphrey-Hawkins legislation. In the early 80s, he was the executive director of the Joint Economic Committee of Congress. He's been a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute, a visiting scholar at the Brookings Institution, and a senior scholar at the Jerome Levy Economics Institute. He has written at least 5 books, including a Principles of Economics textbook co-authored with Robert Heilbroner, and he's written journal articles and magazine articles too numerous to count. Since 1990, he's been professor in the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs and Department of Government at the University of Texas. Please welcome James Galbraith.
Thank you very much. And let me say it's a great pleasure and also an honor to be here to speak in this lecture series named for Lou Douglas, a great figure in the life of this community, a great leader on political matters, and also, I am told, a very nice man who inspired the enduring loyalty of his many friends. I also want to thank you, Lloyd, for, in your introduction, giving the basic figures behind the crisis in inequality. Because it occurs to me, and it occurred to me as I listened to you, that I prepared this lecture almost entirely without them. My more advanced students say that's because I don't have a terribly good head for math. But I have another reason, which is that I'll have the assistance of, a little later on, of one of our Lou Douglas interns in presenting some information in graphical and map form, which will help to illustrate some of the points that I'd like to make here at first. My lecture was entitled The Crisis in American Pay. That's the subtitle of my book, so it was economical in some sense to so title the lecture. But I'd like to amend that a little bit tonight because I will be talking to you about what might be called the new crisis in American pay. I thought after the debate 2 nights ago that I might further subtitle it, Why the Top 1% Don't Really Need a Tax Cut. But as a loyal citizen of Texas and someone who incidentally followed our current governor to Andover and to Yale and to Harvard and then to Texas, I feel I should leave that out. It would be going too far. When my book was published, it was reviewed by one figure who said, and I think without any element of controversy, that it was concerned with the major social issue of our time. And what struck me about that was that it was both true and uncontroversial, but also a comparatively recent development in American political and economic history. If you go back over most of the last century, from the 1930s onward, and look at the economic discussion of those decades, I think you'll find that the topic of inequality is far from being the major social issue of the time. It had been, of course, before that, the central concern. The theory of distribution was the central concern in classical political economy. And the division between capital and labor, and whether that division would lead to prosperity or upheaval, would lead to the triumph of capitalism or its end in revolution and the eventual success of communism, had been the major issues of economics, but in the 20th century they largely ceased to be so. It might be said, in fact, that it was one of the great contributions of John Maynard Keynes, the greatest economist of the 20th century, that he focused the attention of the capitalist world away from inequality and on to the grave and pressing problem of the 1930s, which was unemployment. And in the 40s and 50s and 60s, it was the commitment to full employment which took precedence in policy matters over a commitment to egalitarian values as such. No less a figure in modern economics, and I might say in my personal life, is John Kenneth Galbraith. In 1956, wrote of the remarkable and complete disappearance of interest in the topic of inequality in the post-war years. Through the 60s and 1970s, the subject languished in academic discussion. It was likened to having the same interest as watching the grass grow. And the general view was that articulated in the middle 50s by Simon Kuznets, which held that as a rule, advanced and industrial economies would see steadily declining inequality as their wealth and income grew. But then came the 1970s and the 1980s. And in the 1970s, inequality began to rise in the United States. It's a commentary, I suppose, on the economics profession that no one in that profession actually noticed until sometime in the middle 1980s. And the first people to notice prominently were probably Barry Bluestone and Bennett Harrison. This book was published in the mid to late 1980s, entitled The Great U-Turn, calling attention to this phenomenon. In fact, and as I'll show you shortly, one might even say that so far as the structure of pay, not of incomes more broadly speaking, but of pay, of wages is concerned, the great rise in inequality was largely complete, and we were at a new and higher plateau before the economics profession even became aware of it. But they did become aware. It's not known as the dismal science for nothing. Economists are kind of the ambulance chasers of social science. Distress and suffering are the raw material of scholarly opportunity, a vein of ore to be mined. And the question is, with what tools? And the unfortunate and distressing fact about our subject is that there are really only two tools in most economists' toolkit. One of them is called supply, and the other one is called demand, naturally speaking. And so a literature began to develop trying to explain the phenomenon of rising inequality. And as you might expect, given the two tools, it divided between those who emphasized questions of supply and those who emphasized questions of demand. For those who emphasized questions of supply, the culprit, the alleged culprit, the suspicion of culpability fell on the expansion of American trade. The theoretical argument here is not hard to follow. If we are suddenly trading with countries with whom we've not been trading before, who have and who bring to market a vast supply of low-skilled and underpaid workers, then one might reasonably expect that that trade will bring downward pressure on the wages of less skilled workers in the United States. This was an explanation partly originated with Bluestone and Harrison, I believe. It was certainly congenial to the long-standing suspicion of the American labor movement with respect to international trade, and it was anathema to the large majority of professional economists who were dedicated and committed a priori to the proposition that free trade was a virtue in all circumstances. And so naturally, when the idea that trade might be behind the rise in inequality began to attract public attention, national prominence, the political notice of figures like Ross Perot, another fellow Texan, it's not surprising that even more professional economists took note of it and began to study the inequality question. As it turns out, though, and to be honest and fair, they were not entirely wrong to be skeptical. It was easy to observe that the rise in inequality went far beyond anything that could easily be attributed to an expansion of trade. Trade, even in its new and higher volumes, only amounts to 15% or so of GDP. Many, many workers, tens, scores of millions, are in sectors that are not strongly affected by trade. Services sectors are not directly traded. And in addition to that, most of the trade and even much of the growth in trade was not between the United States and countries dramatically poorer than ourselves, although there was that, but between the United States and countries that were nearly as rich or as rich as ourselves. And so, in the end, the notion that trade was solely responsible for the increase in inequality failed to carry conviction. And the economics profession turned to the other side of the Marshallian scissors, from supply to demand, and most professional economists writing about this in the 1990s decided that something must have happened to the relative demand for skill. That is to say, what they observed, looking particularly at census data, was that the relative wages of people with higher levels of educational credential, with high school degrees as opposed to people who didn't have them, with college degrees as opposed to people who didn't have those, with graduate education as opposed to people who didn't have that, were rising. And he said, well, if it isn't because of an increasing supply of the less skilled labor, it must be because of an increasing demand for the more skilled variety. And studies through the late 80s and mid-90s focused on and even came to take virtually for granted the truth of this proposition. But it only led to another question. What could be driving such an increase in the relative demand for skill? Now, to this question, economists have a final answer. It's the answer they always give when they really do not know what is going on. It's an answer which is extremely hard to quarrel with, because we all believe at some level that it is a deep and abiding massive force in our lives, and the answer, the magic word, is technology. With a specific coinage in the economic literature that we had been subjected to a wave of skill-biased technological change, which is just another way of saying that we don't know. We observe that the relative pay of skilled labor is rising, lacking any other explanation. We attribute it to technological change. But what technological change? What technological change emerges on the American scene in the 1980s? It's irresistible, of course, to lean toward the suggestion that this might have something to do with the computer. It's fair to say, I think, that the economic literature never came to that conclusion definitively. But the suggestion was there, working papers were floating about, correlations were found. People who used computers were getting, the estimate was 15% higher pay, other things equal, than people who did not, controlling for occupational category, industry, and so on and so forth. Therefore, many people not as cautious as the highest of the high priests in the economic profession, inferred that the rise in inequality was nothing but a necessary corollary of the advance of technological progress, something which might be regrettable, perhaps, but about which both nothing could be done nor should be done, because to trifle with it would be to interfere with the process of technological change itself. It's a very convenient, not to say complacent, assumption. And the difficulty with it is that it does not correspond in the remotest way to the facts of history or the dictates of common sense. Taking the dictates of common sense, first of all, one might ask, what is it that computers really do? Do they really reward people with higher levels of skill? Was it the case that when the electronic cash register replaced the mechanical kind, and it became possible for checkout clerks to read off the change that was due rather than calculate it in their head, was that an increase in skill or a reduction of it? And did their pay go up as a result of the introduction of electronic cash registers? I don't think so. Did the experience levels required go up? Did the pay of typists go up when word processors replaced typewriters? Did the skill level required to produce a letter without making mistakes increase or decrease? Is a computer, in other words, anything different from any other historical form of technological change, that is to say, labor and skill saving on balance and in most applications? I think not. I think, in fact, that the only occupational group that can make a strong case for the skill bias of technological change in the computer industry is the academic economists themselves. For us, it was a tremendous boon to be able to stop carrying heavy boxes of IBM cards off to the computer center and be able to do it from our own desktops. But for everybody else, I don't think so. Secondly, there was a problem of where computers are really used. They are preeminently an office machine, but the rise in inequality occurred preeminently in the manufacturing sector. And the manufacturing sector was not the first to computerize, it was late to computerize. Manufacturing floors are dirty, they're hostile environments for computers. A great many things happened in the manufacturing sector in the 1980s that simply could not be related to computerization. And then third, there was a simple problem of history. When you measured the rise in inequality in the pay structure, what you find, and what I'll show you momentarily, is that it starts in 1970 and it reaches a plateau by the early 1980s. The peak is in 1982 or 83 or 84. That depends a little bit on what you're measuring. But when was the personal computer introduced on the American market? 1979? 1980? 1981? 1980, I believe, Apple introduced the Apple II, a toy that sold 78,000 copies that year. I remember the first computer I bought, which was a K-Pro, I believe in early 1983. The IBM PC, the first version, came in 81 and didn't really sell because 82 was a recession year, didn't really start selling until 83. So when you look carefully at the timing, the wave of computerization to which inequality has been ascribed didn't get underway until the rise in inequality itself was nearly complete. And of course, the great expansion of computerization, the late 1980s and the early 1990s, is well after all of that. The result is that the economics profession is at a loss. Those who advocated for the demand side did succeed in defeating those who advocated a trade explanation. But they failed to hold their case against close scrutiny and comparison to the facts. And that left an opening which I have tried to exploit. I titled my book, Created Unequal, to suggest that there was a human hand in the rise in inequality, that it was not simply the consequence of one good thing, the expansion of trade, or another good thing, the progress of technology, but rather the outcome of specific and identifiable policy decisions. And I tried to establish that what was in fact the case. To do that, I took my own measurements, and I found rising inequality through the 70s, as I said, in the early 1980s. When I had long and dense time series measurements, I was then able to ask the question, what are they associated with? And as I shall show you presently, what I found them to be overwhelmingly associated with was nothing more nor less than the rate of unemployment. Other factors played a role, particularly the rise in the dollar in the early 1980s drove a wedge between people who produced goods for export, who did reasonably well, and people who produced goods for import, who got clobbered, who competed with imports, they got clobbered. But by and large, if you had to identify one factor, the thing that jumps out at you is the unemployment rate. In periods of high unemployment and rising unemployment, inequality goes up. And in periods of full employment and general prosperity, the inequality that I was measuring, the inequality in rates of pay and earnings of working people, tended to come down. And that suggested a test, if you like, for the Galbraith thesis. And that test was whether my results would continue to hold good in good times as well as bad. Whether, if, as I did not anticipate when my book was being written in the middle 1990s, if we were to experience a sustained period of prosperity and a return to full employment, would some of the inequality that I had been finding tend to diminish. I had to predict that it would. And my book was published. The data in the book actually only go up to about 1992, so I have what you might call an out-of-sample forecast. And I have to tell you that when you extend the data measured as I did measure it through the 1990s, what you find, and again I'll show you this momentarily, is that yes, these measures of inequality have declined somewhat in the late 1990s with the decline in the unemployment rate. People at the bottom of the scale have gained a bit more rapidly. The scale of pay, of wages, have gained a little bit more rapidly than people at the top. Not surprising, they've been able to put in more hours, they have more bargaining power, they have a slightly more accepting environment for increases in their rate of pay. So, I would argue that insofar as it goes, my original thesis, linking inequality to unemployment, has borne up, even though my book would have sold many thousands more copies if the unemployment rate had gone up rather than down, and this crisis had become even more vivid in people's imaginations than it did. But still, it's not the end of the story. In the late 1990s, and particularly as the project that I've been engaged in measuring various dimensions of economic inequality, it's a very complex phenomenon, began to extend its reach, we began to see measures of inequality going up again, and particularly after, let's say, 1997. It appears in personal income data, some earnings data, and particularly, as I'll show you, in regional data. It doesn't appear in the data in manufacturing pay. So we have a divergence, inequality going up in some measures and down in others. And we have to ask ourselves, what is going on now? And this is why I thought to retitle my lecture, The New Crisis in American Pay. Because the answer has to do with that other part of income which I hadn't been considering in my book, which I deliberately stayed away from. And that's largely, generally speaking, profit income, rental income, income from capital, some of which is distributed as dividends and interest, and some of which goes to those highly paid figures in the corporate world who are so fortunate as to be able to tap in to the capital ownership of the firm through stock options or simply by writing their own salaries. For the most of the post-war period, and indeed most of the period with which my book was directly concerned, profit income does not enter the picture very strongly. The reason is that profit rates are fairly constant through the 1980s, through the early 1980s, and then when they change, they tend to fall. The 1980s were a depressed period for profits. So they're not adding much to the information in the data until they tend to disappear from the data altogether in the period with which I'm concerned. But it's also true that for most of this period, American economic growth is fairly balanced. And so the profits that there are fairly widely distributed. And they don't tend to affect inequality nearly as much as they might otherwise do. There's an exception in the 1970s In the 1970s, a major surge of profits occurs, of course, in the energy sector, in oil. But what effect does that have on inequality in our country? Actually, it reduces it. The rich regions in the north and the east and the west are oil consumers. The oil-producing regions were relatively poor, Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana. And when you had a shift of income from consumers to producers, then the effect actually is to reduce inequality, not to increase it across regions. The slump in the middle 1980s tends to reverse that somewhat. What has changed? By the end of the 1990s, we were seeing a most amazing profits boom in the American economy. And I want to say, as a Keynesian economist, that is to say someone who is a liberal, but nevertheless largely reconciled to the fact that we live in a capitalist system and we're not going to escape from that, even if we wanted to, which we might not want to, I'm inclined to accept a profits boom as better than the alternative, a profit slump and a depression. It is the profits boom to which we owe, in very large measure, the achievement of a 4% rate of unemployment. A remarkable and important accomplishment which has made the lives of many Americans much easier than they would otherwise be or than they were a decade ago. But I would also argue that as the 1990s progressed, that profits boom became increasingly concentrated in an increasingly narrow part of our economy. And this is a problem. Two sectors that dominate our attention, if you pick up the financial pages, particularly figure here. One of them is the financial sector itself, and the other is the information technology sector. We are accustomed to treating the information technology sector as a kind of manna from heaven, a great boon which is giving us a new technological reach. But there's the other side to the story. It is also giving us an enormous concentration of capital wealth. And you mentioned earlier, the fact is all of the tycoons who have emerged in the last decade as figures in popular culture are high-tech tycoons, information sector tycoons. We should be a little worried about that. Even if we aren't per se opposed to tycoons, we ought to be wanting to have a slightly more diversified collection of them. Because the result of what we see, and again I'm going to show you something momentarily, is a concentration of two kinds. A new inequality of two kinds. One of them is geographic, and the other is industrial or sectoral. At this point, I think I will begin to show you, and just to illustrate some of the points that I've been making. Oh, I've got it. Okay, why don't you click it, and let's proceed. This is work that I have been doing in conjunction with a small group of research students, some of whom are named below, as part of something that we call the University of Texas Inequality Project. Go ahead. This is what, the first thing I'm going to show you is the measurement of inequality in the manufacturing sector, which has been the basis of most of the arguments in the economic literature over rising inequality. And what you can see is a pattern. This is actually based on a monthly series that we've computed ourselves going back all the way to 1947. A rise in the 50s and early 60s, a decline in the late 1960s, this period of the Great Society, and then a series of marked increases through the 1970s, up to the early 1980s, a bit of a decline, up again in the recession of the early 1990s, and a decline thereafter. I think to some extent the most recent decline is overstated for reasons technical reasons having to do with the composition of the data set, but the overall pattern is approximately right. And what you can see is that the overall pattern corresponds extremely closely to the movement of the unemployment rate, which is the red series on the bottom. And as the unemployment rate has come down, so has this compression or dispersion series in manufacturing pay. Okay, what are we saying here? Oh, I've mentioned the composition effect. There might be some overstatement in the recent decline. The next thing I want to show you, go ahead, is a measure which is based not just on manufacturing, but somewhat more crudely on a much broader set of data. And you can see, this is again back to actually the late 1930s, you can see the sharp decline in inequality during the Second World War, the rise in the 70s and 80s, the peak gets at the same time, and you see a modest decline in the late 1990s. Still very high by historical standards, and for that reason one would not be complacent at all about current levels of inequality, but nevertheless moving in the direction predicted by the theoretical argument I gave you earlier. Okay. What we then did was to go to a different data set which enabled us to measure personal income on a very narrow regional basis. This is actually tax data, county by county. Go ahead. What we see here are there are increases in inequality, but they're not due to large movements across the states. In fact, inequality across the states seems to have actually peaked or in some measures declined in the 1990s. Go ahead. Rather, the increase in inequality that I would call the new crisis is emerging, and it's actually quite continuous in this period, within state inequality data across county lines. And it's particularly concentrated in a very small number of states. Most of the states are not contributing very much. The large black band at the top is the state of New York. The next one is probably California, and then I would imagine Texas, and I think maybe Virginia down below. But you can see that a small number of states are contributing a huge amount to this increase. If you look at wages rather than incomes, again the same pattern, a small number of states, and in some sense even a more sharp increase in the most recent period. Okay, go ahead. What's the argument that I'm making? The argument I'm making is that a very small number of places have in the late 1990s become remarkably richer than the rest of us. Markedly so, and that one can identify this almost anyone can in fact identify it county by county. So while measured across sectors, there's been some decline in inequality. When we look outside of manufacturing and you look at places where manufacturing is really not very prominent, and for example, the county of Manhattan, but not Kansas, actually it's New York County, you will see a marked increase in the contribution of that one place to inequality in the national data. Go ahead. Keep going. This is New York State. New York County this is a graph which shows the contribution to inequality of each county in the state. Those who have above average income for the nation are above the line. Those who have below average income are below the line. And you can see the vast uptick in the contribution of New York County alone to national inequality. Go ahead. In California, the great phenomenon actually is the decline in the relative importance of Los Angeles, but down below you can see the emergence of Santa Clara County, the bottom most blue band in the inequality contribution of California counties to national inequality. Go ahead. If you just click through these, in Texas, Houston and Dallas are the big contributors. In Florida, the big contribution is coming from Palm Beach County, not a site of manufacturing income. Go ahead. In Virginia, it's Fairfax County. Again, that's actually government workers, Pentagon workers, and people associated with the technology sectors around the Pentagon. Pennsylvania, not so much of a change. The big contributor is Montgomery, which is a mainline suburban county. Go ahead. In Illinois, we can see actually the declining contribution of Cook County. This relative income has fallen since the this data, incidentally, is 1969 through 1997 is what you're looking at. I should have said that earlier. Go ahead. Michigan, help me out, Oakland County. Georgia, Fulton County, the rising contribution. New Jersey, Bergen County. And finally, Kansas. Which county do you suppose that is? Johnson County, of course. Okay. I've done the same exercise on a national basis to give you essentially the same information, but perhaps in a way which is slightly easier to digest. And that is to put it all on a map, if you go one more slide, in which if a county is scaled as red if it has a very high income and population density. That is to say, if it's contributing a lot to inequality nationally. It's scaled as dark blue if it has a very low income but also a substantial population. It's scaled green if it is not contributing much to inequality, either because it's got an income close to the average or because it doesn't have very many people. This is a way, in some sense, of getting a visual picture for the country as a whole of how geographic regions are becoming more alike or more unlike in their distribution of income and wealth. If you just run through it a little bit, you can see what I mean. I'll give you the whole country, first of all. In 1969, and what you've got here, how well do these colors come out? They don't come out all that well. Can we turn down the lights? Is that a little bit better? conclude very quickly. I don't believe that a profits boom is inherently a bad thing. In the absence of a balanced expansion with an appropriately strong role from the public sector, the profits boom is probably the only way we could have reached the full employment prosperity that we enjoy on the whole today. But what I've tried to show in this very sort of rough way is that when profits become intensely concentrated by sector and by region, then we ought to be worried about the social and economic consequences of that. There is a certain, to take a very ugly word, apartheid character to the pattern of regional development in the United States. And you can observe it, I think, almost anywhere in the country where high-income regions lie close to regions with much lower income. They require patterns of commuting for working people that are extremely onerous, prosperous cities where working people can't afford to live, places where wages are high, where working people, construction people go to get contracts because they can't afford to support themselves in their home neighborhood, in their home areas. This kind of thing. A kind of center-periphery relationship emerges internally as well as on the larger global economic scene. And there's a political question. There's a question of the balance of power in the country. Who's running the show? The people who have the profit income or the people who do not? It's a question which answers itself. A true democracy, it seems to me, will run into difficulties, and ours surely is running into difficulties, if the divergence of income and wealth on these grounds, and particularly if it occurs on regional grounds, becomes too great. And then there's another matter, which is an economic matter. I could completely destroy your attention and concentration spans by showing you more of those bar charts. But we have them broken down not only by county, but also by industry. And what you see, you go through it state by state, and you find, as I said earlier, that it's certain industries and not others that are driving the increasing stratification. Banking, insurance. Banks and insurance companies have done well in this decade. It's no wonder the insurance companies are desperately opposed to expansion of health care coverage under Medicare. Banks have done extremely well. There's no wonder that banks have been in the forefront of successful efforts to gain even more freedom from regulatory authority and generally the ability to conduct their affairs as they've seen, both domestically and in the world economy. The technology sector has done extremely well and has been a darling of the investing classes. What you're seeing on these charts is, in some sense, the regional and sectoral manifestation of the rise of the NASDAQ companies, of the IT stocks. But on what is it based? Do we really have the technology in hand that is going to guarantee our future prosperity? Is it really coming out of these sectors? Or should we be worried that these may be companies which are really the froth on a massive speculative bubble? Companies which haven't earned a profit yet and don't seem to have a model for doing so, but are nevertheless able to keep going by paying their top employees in stock options based on nothing more than Wall Street's assessment of their future prospects. Stock options, which can become worthless from one day to the next, and did, in many cases, become worthless on the 15th of April of last year when the NASDAQ crashed. If we're building our prosperity on this basis, and you see some of the inequality consequences, then some of the issues and the concerns go beyond inequality proper. They go to the sustainability of the kind of economy that we have, and whether we shouldn't think seriously about changing the basis on which we allow that economy to be governed. Thank you very much.
Professor Galbraith will field questions. We might take a 30-second break for those who have other commitments, have a chance to leave, and then we'll take some questions.
Sure.
I've seen studies that say, or that seem to imply, that when we have a more progressive tax structure, meaning the rich pay a higher percentage of their income than the poor do, that we have less inequality than when our tax structure is less progressive. Do you agree with that? Could you repeat the question?
The question is whether a progressive tax structure is useful for reducing inequality. I think the answer to that question is yes, it is useful. The tax structure is actually a little bit more progressive now than it was 8 or 9 years ago, interestingly. Less so than it was 20 years ago, substantially less so. I am not a great fan, though, of the conventional economic idea that one should allow the market to determine all matters of relative pay and then redistribute through the tax system according to what your idea of fairness is. I think that we have to pay fundamental attention to the degree of inequality of pay before tax, the distribution that we start with. And I'll give you a reason for that. First of all, I don't agree, I don't accept the theoretical arguments that the market's own judgments are efficient. That's what lies behind this notion that technology did it or that trade did it. But I also believe that the sustainability of any kind of public sector and tax structure really depends upon having a reasonable degree of fairness and equality to begin with. Not perfect equality, but a reasonable and sufficient degree of equality. If the pay structure starts out too unequal, or becomes too unequal, as it did in the 1980s, then you see political consequences of that. The first thing that happens is that those who are really at the top 1%ers, they start buying their own public services, their own security arrangements, their own education, their own health care, which they're entitled to do. They're free to do that. But at a certain point, they ask themselves, why should I pay for my own and then also pay for everybody else's? And so they begin to lobby. First of all, they isolate themselves geographically. They go to the suburbs. And secondly, they start lobbying at the local and regional and national level not to pay a full share of the Social Security payroll tax, not to pay a progressive rate on the income tax. In other words, to get the tax burden down on themselves. And they're generally, and have been, very successful in doing that. And when that happens, the effects are felt further down the scale. Because what happens is, first of all, you have a lot of poor people in an unequal distribution, so someone has to take care of them. And the burden then goes up on those in the middle of the distribution. And they become rightly upset and annoyed. And they become an ally of those who would dismantle public services and Social Security. And so in unequal societies, you tend to have less consensus around broad public purposes than in more equal societies. More equal societies have two advantages. The rich are less segregated and the poor are less numerous. So the burden is shared more fairly and more widely, and there's a broader social consensus behind it. That's why it's easier to sustain that in a Danish case than it is in a Spanish case, for example, just to take examples at opposite ends of Europe. Sure.
I think you might have hinted at it when you said the less wealthy become angry or whatever, but how can we continue to have half of our population supporting 1% of our richest persons getting most of the tax breaks? And current polls suggest that that's indeed the case.
You mean giving political support as opposed to economic support? Well, I mean, I take a more optimistic view of the polls than you do, so I think the number is going to be a bit less than half, and that will be sufficient in a few weeks' time. But I do think that you get this kind of politics of disunion and envy, politics of burden and escape from burden that cascades down through the structure. Now, what can be done about it? Well, I think you have to look at the distribution of income on the one hand and the distribution of wealth on the other. The distribution of wealth is really a question of how balanced our economy is. What you see now, why was there in this summer a major move to repeal the estate and gift tax? Why was it supported by Democratic senators from the West and opposed by Republican senators from the East? I have a hypothesis. My hypothesis is that Democratic senators in the West have an extremely wealthy constituency of nouveau riche entrepreneurs who are still quite young, but nevertheless looking ahead at very, very big estate tax problems. Republican senators in the East have insurance companies in their constituencies, and insurance companies do a very good business insuring small businesses against estate tax liability, business which would go away if the estate tax did. Right? That's the kind of problem that emerges when you allow too much wealth to build up in very small parts of the economy relative to all the rest. It's over there.
You mentioned the title of your book, Created Unequal, and then referred to policies that generated the inequality in the 70s and 80s. But you didn't mention what those policies were. Could you list a few of them and then indicate whether they give us any guide to the kinds of policies that we need now to
Sure.
equalize?
Sure. I actually begin the book, the frontispiece, with a quotation from one of my favorite public figures, Alan Greenspan, who speaks to inequality by saying, a piece of testimony he gave to Congress in 1997, that there has been, as we know and discussed over the years, a significant opening up of income spreads, largely as a function of technology and of education, with the increased premium of college education over high school and high school over high school dropouts becoming stronger. This is typical Greenspan syntax, which is why I chose it. The whole spread goes right through the basic system. It is a development I feel uncomfortable with. There is nothing monetary policy can do to address that, and it is outside the scope, so far as I am concerned, of the issues with which we deal. Now, the first point of my book is that it ought not to be outside the scope, because it is very much under the influence of the policies with which he deals. I would place monetary policy and the behavior of monetary policy over the past 20 years in first line of responsibility for the rise of inequality in the 1970s and the 1980s. What happened was essentially an abandonment of the goals of full employment that had been achieved by the end of the 1960s. An abandonment that started with Richard Nixon and Arthur Burns in 1970, 1974, great recession of that year, again in 1979, 1980 under Paul Volcker, first under Carter and then Reagan in 81, 82, and then again in the late 1980s, early 1990s in the Bush administration. These policy interventions, which were largely, not entirely, but largely monetary policy shocks to the system, drove up the unemployment rate and drove up inequality in the pay structure as well, cutting the ground, if you like, out from under low-wage workers, both in services and manufacturing. A reduction of unemployment, which again I attribute to a much more stable, in part to a much more stable monetary policy in the 1990s, is the factor that's behind the modest change of trend that you observe after 1994-95. What other policies? Well, monetary policy, then we have to consider fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is, of course, interesting because a traditional Keynesian would have to explain how full employment was achieved at a time when fiscal policy was very, very tight, and indeed moved the budget into a very strong surplus over the last couple of years, something which I have expected and continue to expect will cause problems. I think fiscal policy is too tight. But what I think has happened, and is kind of an organic development which is closely associated with both fiscal and monetary policy, is that the credit sector has become much more, if you like, accessible to American households. So we now have 70% roughly of American households own their own homes. That's the highest fraction in history. Of course, there are education loans, there are car loans, there are loans for every purpose in our society, and largely people take those loans in the expectation that they're going to be able to service them. And the government has some sort of implicit responsibility because it will be in trouble if a large part of the population gets into financial trouble. So you have what I might call a Keynesian devolution, in which the responsibility for taking on debt has been privatized, has gone from the public to the private sector. If we don't recognize that explicitly, we could get into a lot of trouble, particularly if monetary policy continues to raise interest rates, cutting off lower income households' access to credit and putting a squeeze on a lot of the others. So we could go on, but those would be the central policy questions that I would raise. I think there are lots of issues to be raised in the international context as well, but that would be the first line of answer to your question. Sure.
Have you looked into any correlation with the relatively divided union spread over this period of time? I look at certain European countries that have much higher union participation rate, and I would suspect that they would not be experiencing this polarization.
Well, we do look at Europe very closely. The answer on unions is that the decline in unionization is not entirely, but it is largely due to a changing structure of employment. When you speak of the shock to employment in the early 1980s, it's a shock to a lot of unionized workers, and they end up out of their unions because they're out of their jobs. So it's very closely. It's not because the union suddenly became moribund. It's because their industries got clobbered. And they got clobbered in part because of the monetary policy shocks that I was just speaking of, and through, in part, the effect on the dollar. Now, the European comparison. I love the European comparison because, yes, it's true, each European country, almost without exception, individually is more equal than the United States. And it's also true that Europe as a whole and most of those countries have higher unemployment rate than the United States. And so there is a conventional argument that you cannot turn on a European television without hearing, to the effect that European unemployment is due to their terrible commitment to social democracy and equality. And if they were only more like us, that is to say more unequal, they could have the full employment that we enjoy. A direct contradiction to the argument I make. Well, how do I respond to that? I say, the comparison which everybody makes between the United States and each European country individually is an invalid comparison and has been so for about 20 years. In fact, Europe is an integrated continental economy on the same scale as the United States. It has no internal borders as far as trade is concerned, as far as migration is concerned, although migration is not all that large. As far as capital flow is concerned, it indeed now has a single currency, But even before that, it had an exchange rate mechanism which kept them pretty well aligned for most of the time. So the right way to draw the boundaries around the European Union as a whole, which means you've got to take account of the differences in income level, the inequalities between countries as well as within them. Now, inequalities across the large regions of the United States are not very large. Texas has an income 85% of New York. Inequalities across the European countries are huge. Spain has an income 60% of Germany. And between Portugal and Norway, it's even bigger. The Europeans are just oblivious to this fact because it has a huge consequence, namely they've got to rethink their whole system of fiscal transfer. And the model for that is the nationalization of the American economy that occurred after 1933, that is to say, the New Deal. We introduced a minimum wage everywhere. We introduced a social security system that pays most elderly people's incomes everywhere, 80%. 60% of American elderly get 80% of their income from Social Security. It's a rough way of thinking it. It's only the top 40% that have any significant income from other sources. The Germans are not transferring to the Portuguese the way the New Yorkers are transferring to the Floridians. Not even close. And we do it all the time, and we get rich out of the process. And then you ask, well, if we're comparing welfare states, well, let's compare them. Who really has the welfare state? Is it Europe, where a government budget limits healthcare expenditure in Britain to 5% of GDP? In the United States, it's 13%. France is 7 or 8. Here it's 13. If you take the government provision of health care in the United States, Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA, that's 7% of our GDP. The other 6% is tax-facilitated private sector. Look at higher education. Who has the social welfare system in higher education? We spend 2.5% of GDP on universities. They spend 1%. Right? Universities, of course, the major recipients of the charitable deduction, or among the major recipients. That's a tax-facilitated measure, as well as the fact that many of us, including those of us here, are in a public facility. Right? Look at, let's see, we could go down the list. That's probably enough. I mean, you look at the benefits under Social Security, you get a similar picture. The Europeans have unified on all the wrong dimensions, and they failed to focus on the critical one, which is equalization across their countries. And as a result, basically, if you want to think about it statistically, to be Spanish as opposed to German in Europe is essentially the same thing as being African American as opposed to white in the United States. 60% of the income, twice the unemployment rate. It's just that it's regionally concentrated in Europe rather than concentrated in particular metropolitan districts as it is in the United States.
What effect do you think the vast aging of the American culture in general, the fact that more people are getting older, will have on the economy and on equality?
Well, I like the aging of America, and I like it more as I get older. And the reason I like it is that old people, unlike you lot, vote. And so they're a major constituency that looks out for its own interest. And I think that's a reason why Social Security, in spite of all the threats on it in the run-up to this election, will survive this election. Because one candidate saw where a large constituency that was actively going to defend its interest actually was. And I'm hopeful that that will put an end to a lot of nonsense that has been put about that comes from fund managers and investment banking firms about the financial crisis of Social Security. It's a phony crisis. It's a crisis generated by people who would very much like to get their hands on what is the Mississippi River of cash flows, the Social Security Trust Fund. That's what this is about, not about anything in the ability of the United States to support old people at a comfortable standard of living. We have that ability. Social Security is not about intergenerational transfers between the young and the old. It's about a transfer amongst old people between those who have children to support them, who would support them otherwise, and those who do not have children to support them and who would otherwise be very poor. And amongst young people, it's a transfer from people who do not have parents to support to people who do have parents to support, because everybody pays the tax. Right? That's the way the transfer mechanism actually works. And both of those transfers, I think we would agree, are a very good thing because we all have a commitment to support the people who worked in past generations, whether we have our own parents to support, would otherwise have to support them or not. I think that we can do a lot on health care that we haven't done. Obviously, the movement to provide better funding of prescription drugs is long overdue. That's become a major part of medical care in the way it wasn't perhaps 15 or 20 or 30 years ago, much more important. But we should do these things, and we should not worry about our ability to afford them. It seems to me that, on the contrary, the fact that we're doing them increases our national wealth substantially because it provides and mobilizes employment possibilities for a great many people who would otherwise largely have menial jobs and who in past generations were largely household servants, who now have professional employment at steady wages. And again, if you look at Europe, what would it be reasonable to do to provide employment in Spain? Services for old people would be very nice. Services for old people that provide paid employment to other people from Spain, right? The problem is that their fiscal structure is such that the Spanish government can't afford it, so the money can only come from Brussels. Yeah.
How does your theory of inequality help us to understand the premium on education? So we know that presently educated workers, so workers with a college degree, earn about 70% of those without, or 70% more rather. They earn about 70% more. Whereas that number used to be a great deal lower for decades ago. So how can we better understand those differences with your theory of inequality?
Okay. The first thing to say is that, in general, the premium on education is not unique. It's not a decisive feature in the rising inequality in the 70s and 80s. Inequality rose. People at the high end of the spectrum tend to have more education than people at the low end of the spectrum, so the difference increased. That's the increasing premium on education. When inequality declines, the premium on education will also decline. So it's in some sense a misinterpretation to attribute this by calling it premium on education to the causal force of education. Okay.
It hasn't declined. We've seen it since 1960s, 70s, 80s. Up to present, it's been increasing so that educated workers are earning increasingly more than uneducated.
Well, my impression actually is that the premium, I mean, we could go back and look at this, but my impression is that that overall the premium on education declined in the 1970s, rose in the 1980s. Whether it's still going up in the 1990s really depends. My understanding is that really it's going up mainly for the very small spectrum of extremely highly educated workers. That's where the increasing premium has been found recently, and that would be loosely consistent with the idea I was just giving you of a very concentrated, sectorally specific boom. That is to say, a boom which only benefits people in a few regions and areas where basically higher graduate degrees are a prerequisite for being employed. Right?
This is another question sort of related to the education direction. Toward the end of your talk, you suggested, as I understood it, that there was a kind of corrosive effect on the consensus for general welfare as a result of the increase in inequality. I understood you right. My question is about that problem from the other direction, that is, from political and not the effect on attitudes, but the effect of political and ideological attitudes on this inequality. And my example would be from a recent study at Cornell University, which studied students going through degrees in economics during their 4 years at the school. And the result of the study was that students in the economics program became by objective standards involving volunteerism, charitable contributions, and so on, more selfish at the end of their careers, as students, because of their economic education. Now, presumably, that wasn't an attitude change that came because of their change in economic status, it was because of somehow the way they were taught. So my question is really sort of twofold. What about the ideological and political effect on this consensus? And second, is there a contribution of academia, and specifically of economic education, to increasing or maintaining economic inequality?
Yeah, well, this is not new. I think there has long been, one might say there has almost always been, going back at least to Malthus, a tendency in the economics profession to breed sociopaths. It's not a universal tendency. I like to think that at least some distinguished professors of economics, from Thorstein Veblen to John Maynard Keynes to my own father, have cultivated a somewhat more decent tradition. So I'm not about to repudiate my discipline simply because it's got disciples of Friedrich von Hayek in it. I think that, and this part was a theme of my talk, that the instinct of the economics profession, which is to assume that they're observing the workings of a competitive market, supply and demand, and then to try and explain every troubling phenomenon as being the result of one of these forces or the other, leads to the kind of abdication of responsibility which we observe. That is to say, if the verdict had been inequality was caused by trade, which in fact it wasn't, although the exchange rate played an important role. If the verdict had been inequality was caused by trade, many economists would have said, but trade is beneficial, it leads to greater efficiency. Therefore, the rise in inequality is just the necessary consequence of progress. And where the profession actually came down, inequality was caused by technology, they come to exactly the same argument. Technological progress is good. It is the force that raises average living standards. If rising inequality is a part of that, well, that's unfortunate, but the price we have to pay. I do think that the Keynesian tradition takes an absolutely opposed view. And one of the things interesting to me, I personally was involved in it, this concerns the question of whether you really think the capitalist economy can be made to function in a humane way. Both conservatives and to some extent traditional radicals, the Marxians, say no, and they agree on this. The conservatives say no, and therefore we shouldn't care. The Marxians say no, and therefore we shouldn't try. And the Keynesian position has always been that yes, you probably can make it work for a while if you're sufficiently bloody-minded about it, and you have a certain degree of political control. And that was the proposition that led to that was written in basically to the Humphrey Hawkins law in 1978, which said we should pursue full employment, reasonable price stability, 4% unemployment, 3% inflation. And the mainstream of the economics profession said, no, you can't do that. Violates the Phillips curve, against the rules of the trade-off. Can have one or the other, not both. Well, here we are. And I would argue that the problem with the current economy, aside from this question of imbalance, which is a speculative bubble that can lead to a blowout, and that's a major issue, is not the level of prosperity or the level of profit, but precisely the issue that these bubble elements raise, which is sustainability. If we could only go on like this for another 10 years, even more families would be in their own houses, right? Even more people would have steady earnings records and college degrees, and I don't see how a better way, practically speaking, to build a strong society than to drive right down that line and see if you can get somewhere with it. Go ahead.
What role, if any, do you think the gender gap in income plays in this?
The question is about the gender gap, and it's a very interesting area. It's one which does not figure a lot in my book because first of all, I'm working substantially with manufacturing pay, so we're dealing mostly with the incomes of men, although there are certain areas which are in manufacturing which are dominated by female workers, garment making, for example. I think there are obviously two issues here. One is, how much do women get paid relative to men in the same occupations? And the other is, what happens to employment in occupations which are predominantly female, occupations which are predominantly male? The within occupation matter, of course, is a matter of partly of discrimination. There is a gap, no matter how much you control for things. The between occupation question is one which I think is not terribly well understood. I think what happened, and which tends to lead to, in some cases, to some fairly bizarre understandings. It is true, for example, that the overall gender gap seems to have declined over the 1980s and early 1990s to some extent. And some people have argued that that shows that women were gaining ground. But what in fact I think was happening was that relatively high wage segments of the male population in manufacturing were losing their jobs altogether. And the change in the averages was not because women were gaining, but because certain groups of men were getting clobbered. The other issue that's particularly important when you think about occupational differences and the gender gap is the minimum wage. If you look at the minimum wage, it is fundamentally an issue of fundamental importance for women workers. It's not very much of an issue for male workers. I happen to be the chair of an economist committee for a fair minimum wage, so we're hoping that we will succeed in getting an increase in the minimum wage. But if you look at the effect on men, it's very little. Most men are paid more than the minimum wage. There are more women who are close to the minimum wage, and therefore when it goes up, it pushes up their incomes more than it pushes up men's incomes. So there's two elements of an answer. It's a more complicated question than I could possibly give you a comprehensive answer to. Well, you already had one. I got another one. Anyone who hasn't? Yes, ma'am.
Well, related, you haven't mentioned racism. It seems like it ought to be mentioned in this conversation.
True, and I haven't mentioned it for the mostly indefensible reason that my data do not identify people by race. This is part, though, of the answer that I was just giving. The rise in inequality in the 1980s strongly affected African American workers. Why? Because this was a group whose highest income members were employed in heavy manufacturing. And when employment in that sector got clobbered, they got clobbered. In 1979, for example, I believe that I was working at that time in the Banking Committee of the House of Representatives, and we had to deal with the Chrysler financial crisis. Something like 1% of the incomes of African Americans in the country came from the Chrysler Corporation. It was some phenomenal number because of the concentration of those jobs in Detroit. So you were looking at a very definite racial dimension of that manufacturing crisis. More broadly, the fact is that minority groups, and this is as distinct from women who tend to be, 30 or 40% of the active labor force, something in that range, who are low income and a small part of the labor force,